from a man who saved his career.
Who was in last place at the end of lap 1 comes home to win the Sakir Grand Prix.
This is how we do it, man. We shut our mouth and we work hard. This is the Mexican way.
To a man whose career is in desperate need of saving.
Perez with a moment to send him into the gravel. Perez makes contact with Charles Leclerc. Sergio Perez is out of qualifying.
How did Sergio Perez go from one of the hottest drivers on the market to the laughingstock of the Formula One grid? Sakir 2020 is the day that everybody remembers, where Checo went from last to first in a racing point. He gets caught up in all the carnage going into turn 3 on lap 1 and ends up dropping to the back of the grid. But slowly by slowly, overtake by overtake, he makes his way back to the front. At this point in the season, the Red Bull seat was up for grabs. With Albon struggling in that second seat, Checo knew he had the opportunity to snatch that seat away from him. And that night in Sakir, under the spotlight, was the deciding race between the two drivers. For months, Red Bull had been looking for a driver who could play a solid supporting role to Max Verstappen. Whenever he wasn't there in the race, they would need their second driver to pick up the pieces and bring home the best possible result. And to be fair to Albon, he was actually doing that at the start of the season. But as it progressed, he gradually faded away and eventually lost all confidence. For Checo though, this was the best season and moment of his career. The euphoria, the elation, the sweet feeling of going out on a high would have been the perfect way to leave Formula One. Because remember, this team had dropped him in favour of Sebastian Vettel for 2021, meaning that this was potentially one of his last races in the sport. It would have been the perfect message to send to all the other teams that they were making a mistake in passing him up. And that message had a big impact on Red Bull, forcing them to take action. 2020 was one of the craziest silly seasons I've ever seen, but this particular twist was the biggest in my opinion. The story of an underrated driver finally getting his shot in a top team again was the perfect storyline to have played out. But in hindsight, moving to Red Bull has not only damaged his reputation, but his spirit. I mean, don't get me wrong, he's on a handsome salary, driving a championship winning car for nearly 4 years now. I mean, he's living the life, so it wouldn't be accurate for me to say he's unhappy or anything. It's just that he doesn't seem to show that same fighting spirit that he did in those midfield teams, and we'll get into why that is as this video progresses. But for now, let's focus on 2021, the start of his Red Bull career. And if you ask me to summarize his performance that season, I'd probably say it's similar to the Miami Grand Prix. Nothing special, just kind of mid. Yes, there's a lot of hype around it, but it never really delivers. And I mean no disrespect. Don't get me wrong, Checo was very solid that year, consistently scoring points and generally just being a good wingman to Max Verstappen. I mean, he was no Valtteri Bottas of course, but that's a whole different story entirely. The car should have been finishing at minimum 4th every single race, and over the course of 2021, he had a total of 10 top 4 finishes. That's 45% of finishes in the top 4. Not bad, but it's also important to note that in 2 of those top 4 finishes, drivers in midfield cars finished ahead of him. Those 2 occasions being Monaco and Qatar. So actually this percentage is more like 36%. For comparison, Albon's top 4 finish percentage in 2020 was 24%. Perez was also able to pick up the pieces in Baku by grabbing the win for the team, a feat that Albon failed to replicate when he had the opportunity to do so in Sakir. The rest of his results that year were pretty decent, and then there were these outlier races like Silverstone for example, where he had to pit for fastest lap to take that point away from Lewis. And then in addition to that, there was Abu Dhabi, where his sole purpose was to emulate the driving standards of your average person on the M25. His performances on a Sunday were generally very good, so what about Saturdays? The average gap between Ricciardo and Verstappen in qualifying in 2018 was a 1/10 of a second in the Dutchman's favour. For Gasly, this jumped up to nearly 6/10, and this increased even more with Albon. So what about Perez? Okay, 5.5 is slightly better, but nowhere near as close as Ricciardo was. Now, to be fair to him, this was his first season. So what was the average gap between himself and Max in 2022? Yeah, that's a significant improvement. 2022 is by far and away the best season of Checo's career at Red Bull. It took him just 2 races to take his first pole position ever, which is a testament to a couple of factors. Number 1, the car suiting him, and number 2, the track suiting him. There was a period of time where Checo was hailed the king of the streets, because whenever he'd see a street track, for some reason, he'd decide to become Prime Ayrton Senna. And while this made for a catchy title and some pretty cool graphic designs, it became a bit of a meme. But when you look at Checo's driving style, you can understand why he is a bit of a street circuit specialist. Compared to Max, he has a very conservative style because he wants to be a lot more precise on corner entry to maximize his exits. In addition, he has extremely good throttle application and feel for rear tyre slip, which is also why he's a master at tyre management. You've also probably heard people saying that Checo likes a car that is typically more understeery, whereas Verstappen likes it a bit more oversteery. And when you look at telemetry, this does check out, as Checo is usually slower going into a corner, but is then able to gain time back coming out of it. This is really effective on street tracks, since they mostly consist of heavy braking zones and very tight corners where you need to get up to the barriers as close as possible. Exhibit A being a track like Monaco, Exhibit B being a track like Singapore, but then you look at an outlier like Jeddah, which has a lot of high-speed corners. Well, Checo's style actually still works really well there, because when he's able to get a good exit coming onto a long straight, he carries that advantage all the way down until the straight ends. The same thing can be said about why he's so strong at Baku. Now, for any Verstappen fans listening, chill with the pitchforks. I'm not saying that Checo is better than him on street tracks, but what I am saying is he's definitely a lot closer, especially compared to the more traditional tracks on the calendar. When we get to the European leg of the season, this man Checo, he turns into a complete ghost. If we take a look at the average qualifying gap between Checo and Max only on the street tracks in the first half of 2022, Checo actually had a very slight advantage over the Dutchman. But then that stretch of races from Silverstone all the way to Monza is... oh man, I feel embarrassed even showing you guys this, but anyway, here you go. Yeah, 7.5 tenths, you might want to start looking for a new career at this point. To be fair, the gap is quite exaggerated, considering Verstappen goes completely ballistic on these types of circuits, and they just don't suit Checo's driving style as much, especially in the Red Bull. Another thing to note is that at the start of 2022, the RB18 was heavily overweight. So naturally it was a lot more understeery, which didn't suit Verstappen's style. But as the season progressed and they started to get the car below the weight limit, Verstappen just took off into a realm of his own. Anyway, after the European leg of the season, we get to Singapore, and Checo was looking for his redemption. In qualifying, he manages to put the car on the front row and capitalizes on this by taking the lead on lap 1. From there, he perfectly managed his race, executing beautifully from start to finish. And of course you could say, oh well, if Verstappen had finished his lap, he would have been on pole and he would have won the race, blah blah blah. But you've got to give credit where credit is due. Checo performed exceptionally well that weekend, and reminded everybody of that fighting spirit that we saw when he was at Racing Point. He has a solid end to the year, but narrowly misses out on P2 in the Drivers' Championship. This was something that he completed successfully in 2023, but that's about as good as it got when it comes to that season, because Checo in 2023 was just all over the shop. He had a pretty strong start, finishing second in Bahrain and winning in Jeddah. In Australia, yeah, we'll ignore that. But then Baku, he came back, and we all thought, could there be a championship fight on our hands? Miami Grand Prix qualifying comes. Verstappen makes a crucial error on his final run in Q3, leaving him down in P9. Perez, on the other hand, manages to capitalize and takes pole position. Surely, he has to win this race, right?
Verstappen wins the Miami Grand Prix.
Oh man, this was one of the coldest celebrations I think I've ever seen. Not only did he make up for the mistake that he made the day before, that celebration right there was a psychological marker, letting everybody know that no matter what you try, no matter the conditions, no matter where I start, I am inevitable. This guy really took that loss in Baku personally, because for the next 10 races, he did not lose, not a single one. There was the Singapore blip, and then after that, it was another 7 races in a row. First of all, being teammates with a driver like Max is extremely psychologically demanding. You're being put up against one of the most talented drivers in the history of the sport, and he's doing things that aren't even in your arsenal. I mean, Checo can put together the perfect lap and still be half a second slower than this guy, because some of the things he's doing just aren't in his toolbox. And then when he does attempt to do the things that Max is doing, it ends up resulting in this, or this, or this. The Red Bull in the hands of Max gets faster the sharper it gets, but Checo can't deal with that sharpness nearly as well as the Dutchman. In most cases, he'd actually have to dial back the setup just to make the car more drivable, but obviously at the cost of performance. Albon talked about experiencing the exact same thing on the High Performance podcast.
Is very quick, so what ends up happening is he has quite a unique driving style actually. It's not that easy to get along with. Everyone has a driving style. I would say my driving style is a bit more on the smooth side, but I like a car that has a good front end, so quite sharp, quite direct. Max does too, but his level of sharp and direct is kind of another. It's a whole different level. It's eye-wateringly sharp. And to give people kind of maybe an explanation what that might feel like, I don't know if you guys play computer games at all, but if you bump up the sensitivity completely to the max and you move that mouse and it's just darting across the screen everywhere, that's kind of how it feels. It becomes so sharp that it makes you a little bit tense. And so what ended up happening was you start off being a little bit behind, but not by much. And then as the season goes on, Max wants this front end in the car. He wants his car to be sharper. And as it goes sharper and sharper, he goes quicker and quicker. And for you to catch up, you have to start taking a little bit more risk. You might be a couple tenths behind one session. Just try a little bit more. Okay, I've gone off. I've had a crash. Then you've got to restart. Then you've lost a little bit of confidence. It takes a little bit more time. And then the next time you try and go out and, do another job, another spin or another whatever. And it just starts to snowball. And every time the car becomes sharper and sharper, you start to become more tense. And I think if you start to not be in that flow state and you're having to really think about it, and every time you go into a corner, you don't know how it's going to react.
And then there's the criticisms. Everybody piling on and saying the same thing over and over and over again. That you're not good enough. That you're not worthy of that seat. And then you start doubting yourself. Getting into a never-ending spiral of negativity, which causes you to perform worse than you ordinarily would. To me personally, Perez isn't as bad a driver as people claim he is. And I know that might be a hot take for some people, but I genuinely feel that if you put him in a different car, that he would perform much better than he's doing now. Think about Ricciardo when you put him in the McLaren. He was nowhere in comparison to Norris, but in the Red Bull against Verstappen, he was at home. He was in a car that suited his preferences and in a team that he thrived in. When it comes to the whole driving style thing, Red Bull would prefer a driver that can deal with the natural characteristics of the car like Verstappen can. The question is, who can be that guy? Because Checo has proved that he can't. There's other drivers on the market that might be able to, but we don't know for sure. So by removing Checo and replacing him with, say, Nico Hülkenberg, for example, yeah, maybe you get some better qualifying performances, maybe you get some better race performances, but what's to say that he'll be able to deal with the sensitivity of the Red Bull in the way that Max can, and better than anybody else that's come before him? Of course, you'd actually need to put him in the car first to see whether that's the case or not, but until then, it's all speculation. Checo is the perfect example of a driver who in one car can be one of the best drivers on the grid, but in another is considered one of the worst. It's honestly quite funny seeing how fast F1 fans switch up on people when they're going through a good spell or whether they're going through a bad spell. And to clarify, I'm not saying the criticisms aren't justified, because they are. I mean, you look at the way Max is performing and the way Checo is performing, there's clearly a lot more potential in that car that isn't being exploited. But let's go back to the Albon example again. In 2020, everyone was on this guy. I mean, he didn't even have a seat in 2021. Then he came back in 2022, proved himself again, and now everybody loves him. Did it mean he was a bad driver before? No. What it did mean though is that when he got into a car that suited his preferences, he could showcase the full extent of his talent. It's the same even for Verstappen. We saw at the start of 2022, he wasn't coping as well when the car was more understeery. Why can't we apply the same logic with Checo? I'm sure at some point, maybe this season or in the future, Checo is going to lose that seat to somebody else. And I don't expect any less. But I will be very, very interested to see how the next driver performs and whether the narrative surrounding them changes as much as it has with Sergio Perez. I hope you all enjoyed. Let me know what you guys think about this topic in the comment section below. And as always, I'll see you in the next one.